Hello, emblem of being. Yeah, well, um, I think by identifying those terms as elements, when you give something a symbol, you put it in the forefront, and you have categories that then you can use to sort other sorts of phenomena. The idea there is that I think I'll talk about it in a second, but agency is implicit in there, and really the next thing to write about agency and time and variability in general, how these elements vary over time. So the point is to take agency as a phenomenon and sort of set up a net around it, where there could be many theories of agency that could be expressed in these terms. I mean, if you think that T is authored by the agent, or if you think T is the agent, or some combination of those things. Okay, those would be different theories about agency that could be told in these terms. So I'm just presenting these terms, and then within those terms, I can tell you, my my answer to those questions. Now, the whole thing about the agency about knowing and intentionality and agency is interesting to me. It's one of the things that these terms I think help us explore. But on the input side, there's things that don't register information that was perceived. Like if you see the red and yellow and blue blotches of color, but it doesn't register it's a beach ball until it hits you in the head. Say, you know, and you memorize it. And by say memorize, I don't mean intentionally. I'm going to memorize this by one of the memorization methods. I mean the way that a raw input just sort of settles into this memory, but it doesn't have to be re-examined and processed so that it registers. Okay, so if you refuse to process information, is this a part of your input still? You know, and so we're going to get into talking about potential perceptions. Things that can be perceived. Both those things that were perceived by other people, things that on principle, through our experience, we feel if we would have looked in a certain way, would have noticed. Things that we got information about, we should have processed a little better and done the secondary uh, level or further of the perception. And on the output, it's even more difficult because, of course, on a physical material model, there's just an infinite number of things we're not perceiving, including things we could not even theoretically perceive. And of a lot of those things that we could perceive, you could never perceive all of them. That's not theoretically possible to perceive all of them, even if any little bit could be perceived. And with the T, we have to limit ourselves to either what is perceived, or, as I say, we'll get into a more enlightened view of what is possible to perceive. At the very least, or at the very beginning, we're limited to what we perceive of the output of our action. That's that's the only thing we can think about. The way of thinking is limited to things that could be thought about. The way of thinking is going to change over time. Okay, just as we consider it to be different between different people, it's going to change in a particular person over time. My way of thinking when I was 13, different from my way of thinking now. So we're going to end up using the formalism to introduce, time in this sense. Uh, but there's a question of how discrete the time is, and there's a certain discrete nature to what I've set this up. I mean, in reality, while we're thinking, we have sparks of images. We often think that is the thinking, but I'm really going to say that, well, no, this is just us generating some of the output perceptions that we're then reperceiving right during that segment of thinking. So we're sort of taking some fundamental idea and generalizing it. So, in your head, when I'm talking about this, you might be thinking of long, deliberative processes. And maybe it should be a small process. And is it really discrete, or is there feedback sort of at every second? Well, I think because of the physics of neurology, it's pretty safe to say that there's some cyclic nature of the feedback being pumped through. So I think it's safe to go ahead and say there's input on the anterior, then thinking, and then output on the posterior. So, you know, my point being that because it requires us to have perceived something, it does bring in this part of agency you talked about the intentionality and knowing what's going on. So that's what T does, and P, is this idea of, well, maybe there are things that are imperceptible, that'll never be perceived, and so we can discuss uh, objectivism and idealism and dream worldism in terms of what we make of P using T. Ultimately, though, I start with P. I'm really going to point out that all we're thinking things, and all we know is thinking, and so that's all we're doing. We're thinking. This agent, some part of the body, is thinking, and we have to think about things like, well, what is P? But we have come up with a theory of these other things. My heart's beating and I'm not thinking about it, or am I? Because it's a part of my brain is making that happen. But then there's cells in my body absorbing nutrients from my bloodstream. I'm not thinking about that. Or wait, maybe you could make an argument that even that is a part of thinking. Maybe getting oxygen into the blood, since the brain needs that so constantly, is a part of thinking. The definitions themselves of these basic terms are not supposed to answer those questions. It's supposed to be able to have ways of expressing the answers. The terms are supposed to provide ways of expressing uh, answers to these questions, right? Not to preclude them. It's not like you accept these terms and you're precluded from your view. It should be possible to state your view. Now, uh, there's some bias in it, like this inclusion of time, but see, this is a repair to the fact that I think of a lot of our formalism of thinking makes a grave mistake not taking time into account. Um, and ultimately, it would be nice to get to a calculus level of mathematics about it, where you're taking in through like integrals and derivatives this idea that a way of thinking is changing as it's going on. All right. So that would be fine, but you still can start off with something that looks more static. But we'll get into the variability because it's all about the variability. It's about, instead of saying there's some right way attitude to have, you have this way of thinking that each person gets for themselves. Right there, we're bringing in the variability. So anyway, thanks for your reply. I didn't mind the challenging tone at all. It was very respectful even before you added the comment. It was like, geez, I didn't know I was so mean. I didn't think it was mean. I think it's good. I like being challenged like that. I don't, know that where it'll go or we'll end up agreeing on the answers. But I thought I'd give an answer uh, rather than make you wait until I write on that part. But this is basically the next thing, the variability of all these concepts and the role of the agent. So I guess I will mention, I basically think that the main agent is the one um, witnessing the perceptions. And I don't know exactly what that does for it, but it seems to me that it can bring up perceptions, so you can bring up a perception and bring up another good one, and that reinforces the first perception and things like this. And it basically is the author of T. That's what I think my theory is. But I see a strong argument to say no, it is T. But who knows? All right. Um, well, I do have some arguments that the way I experience it most powerfully is taking it that I am the author. I'm like an author of T. And yet I see that that is compatible with the idea that T is generating that author. So I'm not actually separate from T. Okay. See, if I jump ahead too much, it will be even more confusing. All right, cheers.